There we go. Okay, good morning. Welcome to CITC's Grant Management Training Class number 1. This presentation is going to be facilitated by the Alaska Native Heritage Center, who developed the curriculum and will be working with us moving forward to help build capacity in the area of grant writing in the Cook Inlet region. My name is Eric Watson. I'm CITC Senior Manager of Tribal Relations. I'd like to introduce Emily and Gregory.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Uvlalotuk. My name is Emily Edenshaw. I am Yupik and Inupiaq. My family comes from Yupik, Alaska. I have the honor to live and work on the Dena'ina lands as the president and CEO of the Alaska Native Heritage Center. Gregory?
Hi, good morning. I'm Gregory Stewart. I am the grant writer and administrative manager here at the Alaska Native Heritage Center, where I also live and work on the Dena'ina lands, and I primarily prepare grant applications as well as overseeing grant-funded projects.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Eric.
Hello. Hi, good morning.
Do you sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, if we can go through, just do quick introductions with everyone in the group, that would be helpful. I'm going to pick on Brianne first. Brianne, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brianne Davis. I am the senior.
Did she freeze?
She did. She's working remotely today.
I love Zoom so much. Okay, Tara, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah.
Manager of Alaska.
Oh, this is fun. Okay, I'm gonna mute Brianne. Okay, Tara, if you wouldn't mind going, I'm gonna send her a message.
Okay. Hi, I'm Tiara McDougall. I am the apprenticeship and internship manager here in Alaska's People. I've been with CITC for 4 years and I'm excited to be a part of the grant process and the classes. So, hi.
Stephen, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, I'm Stephen Adams. EAC name is Dugue. I am the Behavioral Health Director for Connect Tribe. I am also currently working from home. This is my buddy for the day right now, my youngest. Her name is Malia, and you can see her props that she put in my background. But yeah, I'm excited to be a part of this. So thank you, CITC, for putting it on.
Thank you for joining. Don, are you with us?
Hi, sorry, I'm just entering the front phones as well. So I apologize.
Oh, it's okay. Do you want to introduce yourself to the group, Don?
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Dawn Harris. I'm the Social Services Manager, ICWA Worker Behavioral Health Aide for the Native Village of Eklutna. I'm ever so happy to be here with you all, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for joining us. Taylor, are you with us?
Hello, I'm Taylor. I work over at Alaska Native Heritage Center with Emily and Greg. I am the AmeriCorps Vista Grants Management. I think I said that in the right order.
Welcome. David, are you there? Well, no, you're there. You're there without a donut. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm David Croson. I am the Director of Planning at Cook Inlet Tribal Council. I work with grants and I have no donut today.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Emily now.
Well, thank you everyone for introducing yourself. I know that we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I want to just lift up Eric really quick before I get started. You know, when this idea first, you know, when Eric and Tabitha first reached out to the Heritage Center, you know, we had a great conversation around partnering in a really meaningful way. And this is in direct response to a lot of the feedback that they received throughout the region. And so I want to say thank you to Eric and CITC for not only listening to our partners, our tribal partners, but also, working really hard to make sure that, we offer something that is meaningful. And so as I shared, my name's Emily. My background is in grant writing and development, but I want to just be really clear that I'm a student in a lot of aspects. What I'm going to be sharing today, I've learned. I've never really obtained like a professional degree in grant writing. I want to say that there are people who are on the line like David Croson, whom I have so much love and respect for. And, so I just want to start off by saying that, although I've been working in this field for over a decade, it's, in a lot of aspects, like I said, I feel that I am a student and I am always looking to learn and grow my own skills. But in terms of what we're going to talk about today, it's really going to be focused on the pre-activities. So really looking at the application review process and everything that goes into that. And so feel free at the end when I get through the presentation, if you have any questions. I just want to openly state that the presentation is going to be available. There's going to be a lot of terminology in there and resources. And so I would say that always feel free to reach out to me, or again, just refer back to the presentation. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. 1 second. Let's see. Can you see that? Okay, wonderful. So as I shared, we're going to really be talking about pre-grant activities. And, something that I've learned, over the years is that, in a lot of cases, I always think of the end goal in mind, especially when looking at even doing just initial research. And so, so again, I work here at the Heritage Center. Thank you again to CITC for reaching out to us. I wanted to start off my presentation. So when we talk about the philanthropic sector and grants in general, I think it's important for us to really understand the sector in which we're working within, and understanding that, as you all, many of you are working for tribes, you wear many different hats. This is something that I can completely relate to. But I wanted to make sure that we shared some statistics so the sector in which you're working within, and just know that this is just tipping our toe in the water. One thing I would like to share with you is that, not only working here at the Heritage Center, but also being able to work with entities like Native Americans in philanthropy, there is a huge push right now to ensure that there's more equitable funding across the board. There's also a lot of advocacy work happening at the federal level to ensure that when grant funding becomes available, there's not only funding allocated for various agencies, but there's also set aside for Native tribes and organizations. So again, I wanted to start off with a couple of statistics. The first one being, even though Indigenous peoples, we make up close to, and I want to say it's more than 2% of our entire population, we receive less than 1% of grant funding. And so there is that equitable conversation and discussion, like I said, that is happening at that national level. And one thing I would really encourage people, especially when you're working with funders, just make sure that, you are, asking those hard questions. And that's something when we start talking about more private foundations and building that relationship, it's really important to know what their funding history is. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So I'm not going to go through each one of these, but just understand that, when you're starting to, get into this field, know that, you're going to want to understand not only the field in which you're working within, but also what is it going to cost to either develop a grant, write a grant. I know many of you, if you're like me, this is something that you're going to have to lead yourself, but there are a lot of grant resources out there and grant writers that, again, I'm going to be talking a little bit about later. So again, and data also tells the story. So I always like sharing just some quick facts. So some terminology that I wanted to share, I feel like a lot of us live in the world of acronyms, but I wanted to share with you all, the number one thing I always tell my team is to always look at the grant agreement. And granted, this is, pun intended, this is, the grant agreement comes after, the award has been issued. But once you receive an award, just know that, if you're wondering if things are allowable, the number one thing I always look to, and that's why I underlined it, is look at not what was written in the proposal, but what you agreed to. And so again, this is just a resource. I also included on the last bullet, this is a link, and it shows a lot of other, other terms that you could look at. So let's go to the next slide. So in terms of registering your organization, or, just know that, again, we're living in the world of acronyms. I would just say, get used to it. And I know for me, when I started, I'm like, what's the DUNS? What's the SAM? Just know that these registrations are, it's gonna, this is specific to federal grants. And so knowing, the first thing is making sure that you have your DUNS number, which is, again, the Data Universal Number System. And so this is really gonna be your first step when you're starting to look at federal opportunities. The next, making sure that your organization is registered with SAM. Grants.gov, and this is something else that I often share with my team here. And just like a tip, make sure that as you're getting these, your DUNS number, your SAM, your login, all of these should be housed in one, either a spreadsheet. I would not have it kind of saved on your desktop. I would have it on either an Excel spreadsheet that you could share with your grants team, but have it housed in one area. Something else that I would just like, as kind of a heads up, a lot of these passwords, these registrations, these, you're going to have to, for example, I know for us, some of these are set to expire. And so, and it's really hard. Like, you can't just type your password to be password. It always falls into that it's complicated category. So again, just make sure that you're housing this kind of like in a clearinghouse for all of your passwords, all of your login information. And that's something that I had to learn the hard way. And it's really, really frustrating when you can't remember, or if someone's moved on from your organization. And so it's just good for it, it's really good for you to start that practice now, to create kind of, like I said, that cheat sheet of all of your DUNS number, your SAM registration, your login, and just know that each database within, for example, like what we have here, the ERA Commons, it might look different, or it will look different for varying agencies. And so again, like I said, this, like, the number one thing I want to make sure that everyone knows is not only to get to register your organization, but then also make sure that you're housing your passwords in a place where it's really easy and accessible. So here, this
Hey,
is something
Emily.
I'm like, go ahead.
Eric has a question.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention two things to build on what you were saying in that previous slide. One piece of advice, give yourself as much time as possible registering for those. I learned the hard way with ERA Commons. That took 4 to 6 weeks just to process. And so if you're applying for any of these registrations, just give yourself as much time as possible for that. And also work with your finance team or compliance team, because both typically have access to these numbers, and they can let you know if anything's expiring and if you have to reapply or not. That's all I wanted to mention. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. And if you feel free, if you have any questions, or if there's anything, I know, David, you're here, but if there's anything else that you'd like to add, or if Gregory, Eric, please feel free. But again, like I said, my biggest thing when I've gone through this is, not only making sure that we're registering, checking in with your finance team, but also making sure that your house is in order. And, I'm happy to share out. And that's something else I want to share. In addition to this presentation, we also have a lot of kind of templates that we've used here at the Heritage Center that I'm happy to share out with everyone. So when we're thinking of going after grants, this is something like I was trying to think of like, what's the best way that I can, and I am not I find, like full disclosure, I find zero joy in cooking, but I was really thinking of like, okay, for us to be successful, what is the recipe for success? So there is a method in which, just making sure, like I said, you obtain your DUNS number, you register with SAM, and really that's going to allow you to start looking for grant opportunities. Now, that being said, a really, something that I would just really caution everyone who's on the line today, for me, when I started out looking for grants, there is, especially right now, we're all drinking from a fire hose. It's going to be really important that your tribe or your organization has an annual grant strategy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. And the reason why I'm sharing this now is because there is so much funding available. And something that I don't want you all to do is just to go after funding because funding is available. You really want to be strategic, because one of the things that I've learned is that some money is too expensive. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But again, when you're looking for, when you're starting to look for grant opportunities that's available right now, you're really going to want to make sure that you have an annual grant strategy that is, kind of on your desk, in your back pocket. And I'm going to be sharing some grant resources and some people's names that, that I would highly recommend that can help you develop your annual grant strategy. Another thing that I would say that is part of ensuring the success to obtain a grant is, the best way to learn the grant world, the grant writing world, the nonprofit world, the philanthropic sector, is to not only get on, there are so many different opportunities out there to become a peer reviewer or, so just know that the best way of doing this is to jump right in and to see, for example, like if ANA, which is the Administration of Native Americans, if they have any sort of opportunities to review any sort of applications, that is a great way for you to build your knowledge of not only the funding opportunity, but also it's going to build your capacity as a grant writer. And so just know that's something that I highly recommend you all, not to add more work to your plate, but know that that's something that again, it's the best way to gain experience. So then you have your award and implementation, data tracking, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a little while, but just know that and this is something that I would learn from our mistake at the Heritage Center. And I've worked at other places where this has happened, where you're so focused on doing the work, some of the measures and the data tracking might be pushed off to the side. I would just really encourage everyone to make sure that there's the data tracking in place, just because, at the federal level, they want to know, they want to not only know what you've been doing, but they want to measure the impact. And so just make it, your kind of approach on the front end to make sure that that is in place. And as always, reporting, and that's a whole other presentation, but that in and of itself is very, very key to ensuring that you have a successful grant. So one thing I wanted to share with everyone, when we talk about private versus public funding, I think oftentimes, especially when working for tribes, there is this, there's so much federal funding that's available. And so I wanted to share this slide just so people can have an understanding, like when we talk about private foundation, and even within the terminology of private foundation, there's various terminology. And so this slide has a lot of content, but, there are advantages to working with, or not working with, but also going after private versus public foundation funding. So from a private standpoint, and this is something that it's going to vary, and what I wanted to share here is that, if you were to go after private funding, there are advantages. One of them being rapid turnaround time. Like I shared in the presentation here, that's not always the case. For example, this last year, when we received a Department of Ed grant award, or when we submitted it, it actually took longer for Mellon Foundation, and this is like no knock to them, but that's not always the case. But I want to say in a broad brushstroke, private foundation, there is a much faster turnaround time, but again, that's not always the case. Fewer level of review, fewer regulations, and fewer applicants in the pool. In terms of the disadvantages, you know, they're not as big as some of the federal grant opportunities that are out there, or state opportunities that are out there. And so when you're starting to look for these grant opportunities, you know, based off your annual grant strategy, going out there and doing this, really, you know, weigh the pros and cons. And so that's why I wanted to share this slide, is that there are advantages and disadvantages to both. And so I'm not gonna read verbatim, but again, please refer to this slide. And you know, Eric, is there anything that you want to add to this, or Gregory? Nope. Okay.
I think you covered it.
Okay. So oftentimes, and this is something that, you know, when working at, you know, and I didn't share this in my introduction. So I worked at Tlingit and Haida for a couple years, and before that I worked at First Alaskans. And so, you know, having worked at both a nonprofit and then a tribe working with a consortium of tribes, you know, this was something that I found it really interesting, that obviously at Tlingit and Haida, you know, primarily a lot of our funds derive from the federal government. And there was this huge kind of desire and need for us to go after foundation funding. And so the reason why I wanted to include this slide in here is just to share with everyone, you know, when you're looking at going after foundation funding, there's going to be, you know, not only like relationship stewardship, but then also just understanding that some of the terminology, there's going to be a lot of overlap with public funding, but also knowing that it's gonna, I don't want to say it's a completely different world, but your approach will be different. And in a lot of cases with foundation funding, you know, as I'm sure many of you will have experienced, a lot of it, rather than going out and having this kind of open call for applications, some of it, you know, a lot of them are invite only. And so that is going to rest a lot on relationship stewardship, which, you know, I would say that in and of itself would be an entirely, you know, it would be great to do a presentation just on that. And so again, this is just a resource page for you all, a lot of information on here, but please refer to it when you really want to look at, you know, really what is a foundation. So I wanted to share some resources with you all, databases, subscriptions. This is just like really a slice of the pie. Not only are, you know, can you search grants.gov for grant opportunities. There's obviously always do Google, but there are places like grantstation.com, but there are also a lot of subscription services like Chronicles in Philanthropy, Philanthropy Northwest, Native Americans in Philanthropy. I could go on and on, but a lot of these subscription services and these memberships offer a lot of grant opportunities. Some other ones that I've seen, depending on which sector that you're in, for example, like US Travel, IANTA, which is American Indians Alaska Native Tourism Association, they also have a lot of funding opportunities. So I would encourage you all, if you are members of any sort of organization, you know, for example, like IANTA, really look at some of the resources that they share out. So I wanted to share this just as an example of a lot of databases and subscription and membership services offer grant opportunities.
And I'm going to make one quick plug. Every month, CITC hosts the monthly grants teleconference, where we do discuss opportunities between health agencies, other nonprofits, tribal entities. That's another way to kind of get your pulse on what's available as well.
Yes, yes. And I know Gregory and David, you both are a part of that, right? Yes. So this is just an image I wanted to share with you. When we think of, and this is what I shared in my introduction, when we think of going after a grant, you know, it's always, even if we're talking about pre-grant activities, you're going to want to really take into account the entire grant life cycle. So what is it going to take to generate your idea? What's in terms of capacity internally to implement the grant? what's the time commitment to do the reporting? And this is something that, full disclosure, I am constantly, when the moment I start looking for grants, I am thinking of these different types of, do we have the internal capacity? Granted, a lot of grant opportunities that are out there, you could write in positions, but then also just thinking of like data management, all of these other kind of infrastructure, understanding like, are we in a place to really not only steward the grant, but also implement and close out the grant? So again, just always kind of thinking of that full cycle when you're looking at grants. And like I shared earlier, some money is too expensive. And you might be wondering, like, what do you mean by that, Emily? This is something that I have had to learn the hard way. This is something that, oh, it's great. We have this $10,000 or this $100,000 opportunity that's in front of us. Really look at, when you're going at it, or even if they've reached out to you and they've asked you to apply, again, look at the application. What's the time commitment that it's going to take you or your admin or your tribal administrator to not only fill out the application, but then also report out on the application? Really look at it. And I'd like to share on the foundation side, there's been more of a move, especially during COVID, to distribute grants that, I don't want to say have no strings attached, but there is this kind of growing recommendation that, this is something that as, people working within and throughout the philanthropic sector and the nonprofit world, we are really advocating that, look, if you want to trust us to do this work, don't have strings attached. And that's actually something that we've been able to receive here at the Heritage Center. And so just know that that is a growing recommendation that I've seen really all across the country. But again, like I said, keep in mind, and this is something that I always have in the back of my mind, like, what is it going to take? How much time is it going to take for Gregory or for myself or for Taylor to fill out the application? And how much time, are they going to want us to, spend, hours and hours on, a grant that's only $10,000? And, in places that I've worked, and the reason why I'm sharing this, going back to the annual grant strategy, I've worked at places where they won't even go after anything less than $25,000. Just, again, weighing the cost and benefits of, capacity, staff time, reporting. And so again, just kind of keep that in mind, or I would say, like, hear my voice when I say, like, some money is just too expensive and it's not worth it. And so there are other things that I want to make sure that that you look at when you're looking at grants is look at the history of giving, look at the board, making sure that, and this is something that it's more of a philosophical, like, this is something that one of my mentors have shared with me, and this is something I'm going to share with you all, is working for Native organizations and tribes, we are never on our knees. We are never in a place where we're less than or we're not equal. And the reason why I say that is because although we are going after grant funding, we are bringing our community, our knowledge, our, the work that we're doing, the heart and the passion. They're getting to work with us just as much as we are getting to work with them. And so I wanted to share some of that kind of philosophical approach and that lens that has been passed down to me. And, this is something, that type of coaching, if you will, is something that's really been a source of strength for me as I've really not only looked for grant funding, but also built my relationship with grant funders. As I shared earlier, there is this kind of growing trend of, we want to be more equitable. We want to make sure that, not only social justice, but we want to make sure that our funding reflects diversity and inclusion. And so when I included, or when I built this slide, I wanted to share with everyone that, really make sure that, whether if your tribal council has either passed like a diversity, equity, and inclusion commitment statement, management, make sure that the funding that you're going after, especially when working with private foundations, making sure that there's that mission alignment there. And so again, like I said on the slide, just remember, and like I said, tell yourself, some money is just too expensive. So our annual grant strategy. So this is something, this is something that's really going to be a living document. And I would highly, highly recommend that if you don't have an annual grant strategy right now, this would be your first starting point, for your organization or for your tribe. One thing that I'll just openly state, someone who we've worked with, which I know David, and just openly sharing, she really attributes a lot of her work today to David, who's on the line, is Katie Brinson. She helped us develop our annual grant strategy at the Heritage Center. Number one thing, it's worth developing your grant strategy to where you are being more strategic in the funding that you're going to go after. So you're being more strategic with your time, with your capacity, with your infrastructure. And so just, again, it's not only about raising funds and going after funding, it's also making sure that you're being stewards of your resources, which includes your time, your knowledge, your energy. And that's why I say the number one thing when you're looking at going after any sort of grant funding, grant resources, start off with an annual grant strategy. And I'm happy to share, some of the ones that I've done in the past, but just keep in mind, kind of like an annual, you have your I'm sure your organization or your tribe has a strategic plan. Make sure that this is something that is not just on a shelf, it's a living document. But again, like I said, the first step is make sure that you have your annual grant strategy. It is also reflective of your strategic plan. And like I shared earlier, it's updated. Is there anything else, Eric, that you want to add to, or Gregory?
No, I just think, moving forward, if this is something you haven't yet adopted and you're going down that path, there are contractors, there's people that can assist in the process. There is a host of tribal partners that can offer support as well, navigating some of these steps. So just know that you have support moving forward if you need some assistance doing this.
Yes. And so the one thing that I would, and I included on here is part of that is, part of your annual grant strategy, it's going to be really key to understanding your budget. And this is something that I know Eric and I have talked about, if you are new to the grants world, building a budget, learning how to, and this is something, it literally took me going to school to really learn how to read and understand balance sheets and financial statements, but really understanding your tribe's budget and either not only your tribe's budget, but also your project budget. That's something that Eric and I have talked about, having a grants training program, or a work session that's specifically just on budgeting and reporting. And so know that a key to developing an annual grant strategy is understanding your budget. So I included a link here as well. And like I said, a really good resource for you all to help you develop an annual grant strategy is Katie Brinson. She's phenomenal. I love her. So here are some resources, kind of going back off the subscriptions, memberships, here are some grant resources for you all. The number one thing that I wanted to make sure that you all should be kind of plugged into, we have an Alaska Grant Makers Tour. This is where Rasmussen Foundation brings up several foundation funders. If you're not kind of plugged into this, I would highly recommend reach out to Rasmussen Foundation and see how you could either, if you're able to get on the pre-COVID, they would do a train ride with a lot of grantees or potential grantees and nonprofit tribal leaders, as well as with the guests who have come up. But, you know, not only the grant makers tour, really looking at like the Association of Fundraising Professionals. You also have the Grant Professional Association, some more local examples that I wanted to include: the Matsu Health Foundation and the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority. They have a lot of great resources. And as I'm sure many of you know, there are other agencies like ANA that have resources. That in and of itself, and this is something we've actually made use of that, especially with technical assistance. Make sure that you reach out to them. That's free training. That's free, you know, free resources for you. So why wouldn't you want to do it? And so I included some other links in here for like a grant toolkit, and then some grant writing tips. And so again, this is just a list of various grant resources that you can Google and refer back to, not to add more work, but like I said, for me, I feel like in a lot of my, especially when I started off, I felt like I was stumbling in the dark. And so I wanted to make sure that you had this list. And that, like I said, it's just tipping your toe in the water. There's so many other grant resources that are out there. So, kind of going off the understanding that there is a recipe for success. You know, there is a method. You know, you have to make sure that your organization is registered. You have your 501c3 status. You know, you have your annual grant strategy that you've done. You know, you're making sure all your passwords are kind of housed in a central place. The other thing that I would highly recommend is create a grant log. And I know this is something that you know, it's going to look different at different organizations. This is an example that I want to say I created. This was kind of a working log that I created in 2018, but I'll just quickly go through it. So what you see here underlined, this is the various programs. So we had community services, educational services, elderly services, employment and training. So these were the different kind of programs at the tribe that I was working at. So what I did under here is then all of the different kind of grant funding opportunities that were available, I put it under the program in which it was, you know, it would apply to. But then I would say the one step further is saying, okay, so within that program, what's the project that it would be applicable to? And then I've added the various kind of areas of work that we would try to go after funding, and then the grant deadline. And then, you know, I cut it off because I said amount requested, but I've had things like reporting grant deadline, you know, fully funded amount. And this has been kind of going back to the tip on having your passwords housed in one place. This is really something that, I mean, I just sent an email to Gregory the other day, like send me our most recent grant log. This is something that I highly recommend that you use. This is also another column, if you will, that you can add to, is the indirect rate, which we're going to talk a little bit about later, because in some of these, you know, some of the funding announcements, depending on what your federal indirect rate are, you know, there's a cap, and then you get into, once there's a cap, then there's a shortfall, and that, you know, just make sure that all of, you know, this is a template that could be tailored to your tribe or your organization. But again, going back to, you need to make sure that your passwords are all housed in one place. You need to make sure that you have your annual grant strategy. This is a template that you could use to start doing all of your grant tracking. Eric or Gregory, is there anything else that you'd like to add to this slide? No.
I will just add that on our grant log currently, I have like a column that's just for notes, so that I can convey, you know, like brief updates to different members of our staff if they need to go in and check and see where a project is at. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but I find that the grant log is a good place to keep, like, you know, the latest update on the project.
And I'm going to jump in, and actually, I'm going to pick on David for a moment. David, could you share a little bit about CITC strategy with having either a grant log or a screen matrix or different tracking tools that we use?
Yeah, we maintain a spreadsheet of every grant that we screen. of every federal grant that we screen. And I do have a, pardon me, and another spreadsheet that records basic information about every grant that we've applied for and sort of the status of it.
Yeah, and this is
Happy to share those.
awesome. Yeah, and that's actually, I'm glad you shared that, David, because this is something where if there's a lot of transition at your organization or your tribe, and if you have this, and this, when you think of, you know, these different type of templates, you're really laying the foundation. So if you decide to move on, or if, like, God forbid, you know, something happens, you know, you have this, kind of infrastructure, if you will. And that's something that, you know, for me, like when I was working at Clinket and Haida, you know, my kind of personal goal was I want to leave it better than how I found it. And, you know, like full disclosure, they're an incredible tribe, but, you know, making sure that you're laying the foundation with, you know, grant tracking log spreadsheets, Excel spreadsheets. And like I said, do not reinvent the wheel. We have all of these templates out there for you, and it's a great resource. So when, you know, the winter comes along, January, or if, you know, October 1, when the new calendar year starts, you know, you're able to, okay, who did we apply to last year? Okay, it wasn't funded. It's a good refresher for you to go, maybe they've changed their funding requirements. Maybe they've changed their scope. It's a great way for you to really track what you've done and what you've screened, and also awards that have been given. And just like, go ahead.
Just another, it's kind of an obvious thing, but in the past, the way you keep your records of the actual grants you applied for, once upon a time, we kept them in folders that were organized by the grant writer. Years later, if you want to go back and, you know, find what your own organization has done, it can be challenging to do that once those grant writers are gone. So something as simple as, you know, organizing by year in a standardized place pays off.
It does. It does. Yeah. And that's something, like I said, remember, you know, you all are working at your tribes, working at your organization. And these are just really, like, I want to say it seems simple, but you really are laying that foundation for success that, you know, either others can pull from or you can refer back to. And like I said, we have all of these templates available and we're happy to share them out. So indirect costs. And so this is something that, you know, I would just like openly state, like, not to the person that I just really want to lift up Amy Fredine at CITC. You know, for me here at the Heritage Center, you know, we have our federal negotiated rate, you know, with the Department of Education. So we have our indirect cost rate. And so I would just say that what we've done here, make sure that your tribe, your organization, your nonprofit, you know, make sure that you have your ICR. But again, when you're going after funding, the key thing to really look at, the two main points that you're going to want to look at is what, you know, is there a cap on it? And if there is a cap on funding that, you know, what's that shortfall? Now, I don't know, and this is going to vary tribe and organization to organization, if you guys have a indirect fall or an indirect rate fall strategy. And that's something that I know at Clinket and Haida, I would highly recommend if it's something that you want to refer to. When I worked at Clinket and Haida, their approach was, if there's a shortfall, we would have to go through the tribal council to even get it approved to go after that funding, because that, you know, the indirect cost rate, or excuse me, that those monies really help cover overhead, facilities, salaries. And so to really go after funding, and if there's a shortfall, like I said, you know, an opportunity that you could really look at for your tribe is maybe implementing what that shortfall strategy is. And like I said, or that process. Here at the Heritage Center, and a quick example, you know, we have gone out, you know, we've made the commitment, or we've made the decision, like, we're going to go after certain funding if we're only going to get 15% versus 26%, and that's our indirect rate right now is 26%. And so, but what happens with that shortfall? And so over time that will chisel away and it's going to make an impact. When you really quantify that, that's something that you should be looking at as leaders of today and really being, fiduciary stewards of your organization and your tribe, understanding, not only, what's the funding that's available, but also looking at the indirect cost rate. And I don't know if there's anyone, if Eric or if anyone else wants to add to that.
I do, and I'm actually really glad that you covered this. And I do want to mention that just because a grant would either give you the minimus, the minimum indirect rate or no indirect rate, do not assume that your agency may not want to pursue it and may be interested. A grant that I personally manage, we collect no indirect and there's no money for staffing, but it aligns with our vision and our mission and something we still want to provide to the community. And so these kind of decisions really do end up at the leadership and board level typically. But I'm glad you mentioned this, Emily. This is a good slide.
Yeah. And David, do you guys have at CITC an indirect shortfall process?
It's done on a case-by-case basis. It's done on a case-by-case basis. Not taking indirect is a big deal. And I'll say that the most common, if you have an indirect rate, most commonly, it's a reason for us not to apply. We always ask, and there are exceptions, as Eric notes, but I understand that making up for not taking indirect is not an easy thing.
Yes, and like I said, I'm happy to, if it's not included in this slide, but if anyone on the line wants any sort of, I'm happy to reach out to Teresa, who is the CFO at Clink and Haida, and I might even have some examples of working at First Alaskans at other places. It's important to really look at, like, I can't drive in enough the importance of making sure, not only what's, the time it's going to take to go after funding, but really looking at, if they fund indirect and if they fund it, if there's a cap, because like I said, over time, like Eric said, it's important for us to, if there's mission alignment and if this is really going to make an impact in our community, but over time that could really have an impact. And like I said, there are other organizations that have processes in place to this where you do not have to reinvent the wheel, and I'm happy to share those with you.
And one last thing I do want to mention is that if you do not have a federally recognized or a federal agreement for an indirect rate, I believe the BIA rate is 10%. So that's, I think, the maximum you can capture without that agreement in place. Is that correct, Emily?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to make sure I follow up on that, but yes, I think the last I heard it was 10%. Yes. In addition, which I don't have it on here, when we do our budgeting slide, something talking about pass-through rates, which I don't want to cause any confusion, but indirect rate, and I guess my main message that I want to share with everyone here, just not only make sure that you have your indirect rate, but also making sure, really looking at the indirect shortfall, if there is any. So going back to kind of grant opportunity screening, really making sure that we have, a relationship with a funder. If you don't have a relationship with a funder, I would highly recommend, like, reach out to your network, whether if it's like the CITC group that meets, reach out to me, reach out to, someone at Rasmussen Foundation. If you're interested in looking at, for example, like KC Families, or, if there's someone at the Bill and Melinda, maybe it's not, I want to say it's still the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That's the name of it. I don't think it's changed. But if, understanding that if you do not have a relationship with them, I would say that there are people within, in Alaska, that if you reach out to them, like Diane or Angela Cox, reach out to your network to see if they have a relationship with a funder. And, the number one thing I would say when working within private foundations is that it's very much so relationship based. And so I would highly, highly recommend tapping into your network and really, really, trying to find ways to build relationship. But again, looking at funding history, reporting requirements, and I know I sound like a broken record, but I could not really emphasize this more. So again, really looking at the relationship with the funder. And so Gregory, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so one thing that I've noticed since I'm somewhat new to the world of grants and new to working at the Heritage Center is that we have longstanding relationships with a lot of our funders. And so reviewing internal files and really double checking on what things have happened in the past, right? Like looking back and seeing exact areas where funding has been provided by specific funders and being able to build upon the successes or potentially the mistakes that maybe happened in the past, and kind of showing that you have lessons learned or showing how you're going to increase impact, or really kind of structure your grant applications looking to the future based on the history that you've had with the funder. So one thing that I do is that I'll go back and review and figure out the applications and the reports from different sort of funders that we've done if we're going to pursue a new opportunity with them. And I'll take down some notes, right? I'll kind of figure out what we did well and what we maybe need to fix or modify for future applications. So I create a little cheat sheet for the funder basically before I go and prepare a new application. This is, I found, especially important with like foundational funders, because it seems that there's a lot more of a individual relationship building capacity within that. Program officers with federal grants or federal government agencies, they look more to the documentation. So I build the documentation much more effectively in federals, but with foundational, I kind of look more towards our internal ability to communicate with them. So that's sort of one way that I do it. I definitely make a little cheat sheet every time I'm looking to apply to something new based on what we've done in the past.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And the other thing I would say, just as an example, we had a grant here at the Heritage Center, and because we went through transition, that was an example where, we didn't live up to, or we didn't do everything that we said we were going to do in the grant agreement. And it was really through the relationship stewardship, like we had to take a break from that funder. But during that time, it allowed us to like make sure that we got our house in order to where, when we went back out or when we reached out to that funder again, some of the mistakes that we made on the grant, where I want to say kind of went to the wayside, we made sure to fix those. So then when we re-engaged them, we said, you know what? We learned from that mistake and we're ready and we're doing it now. And I'm really proud to share with everyone, we were able to get, they're actually funding our holocultures overhaul. And so our failures or your failures can be your biggest teacher. And that's something that I want to make sure, like, and just as human people or as human beings, we're all going to make mistakes. And especially when it comes to like, okay, grant reporting deadlines, whether or not, again, looking at the grant agreement, there are going to be times where, oops, we haven't had time to finish this objective, or we haven't tracked. I just want to make sure that everyone knows that, just give yourself grace. And, the Heritage Center, like I said, we've been in that situation where we've missed the mark, and but it's really learning from that mistake where we've said, okay, we're going to take a break from that, we're going to make sure that we get our house in order, we're going to do what we said we're going to do, and then we re-engaged. And so don't, if for whatever reason, if you've any sort of like grant that has gone to the wayside, it might be an opportunity for you to really look at it again and say, okay, how can we do this differently, and how can we re-engage?
And I'm just going to mention one quick thing. Communication is so important, whether it's a public grant or a foundation grant. If you're having challenges, or if you're afraid you're not going to meet certain goals or objectives, just communicate with them. And sometimes you can modify your grant. I just think that's the best advice I can give going forward with that.
Yes. And what we often say here at the Heritage Center, communication is fundraising, and fundraising is communication. And so yeah, communication is key. And so, and I'll just say, oftentimes, fundraising is like, people going out and like the work that Cheyenne Beatty does. But when we think of like the grant writing, in my mind, it all falls under the umbrella of development. And so again, yeah, thank you for sharing that. So this slide just really talks about really looking at the funding history. Like we shared earlier, like not only going to the funders' websites, looking at the history of their funding, really looking at some of the successful projects, and like full disclosure, that's actually a way that I've, in my time, I don't know if David, if you've ever done this, but I know for me, looking at, for example, like, oh, okay, ANA, we didn't get funded this round, but you know what? I'm going to go and I'm going to see who got funded and their projects, so I can see how I can maybe pivot or model. And this is something that I often share here at the Heritage Center. Even though we've gone out for funding, we've researched funding, we've written the application, we've done everything that we've done everything that we've done, put our best foot forward, and it wasn't funded, it's still a great learning opportunity, because then you have a proposal that you can take and maybe amend or tailor to another funding opportunity. But it's also going to allow you to look at some of the other projects that have been funded. And so just like kind of tip, I've done that and it's actually worked in our favor. And so just know that even though if your application wasn't funded, it's still an opportunity. Don't take no for an answer. You could go out and you can, like I said, you could tailor it to other funding opportunities, but then you could also see what other organizations or tribes were funded. One of the things that I want to just share, the reason why I wanted to include in here, is really looking at funding history, especially when it comes to agencies like EDA, which is the Economic Development Administration. Their philosophy at the EDA, and this is something that I know Gregory, we've learned here at the Heritage Center, their philosophy is going to be a little different than other agencies like ANA, which is the Administration of Native Americans. EDA's philosophy is really, we want more money going out to the community versus coming to the organization. So just really looking at not only their funding history, but their philosophy and how they want to roll out the funding. So again, that's going to be really, really key. So really look at the history of giving, their philosophy of giving, and then another way to look at what they've done is look at their 990s. This is something that, and this is something else I would say, when you're looking at to maybe go after a big job, another way to look at how you want to negotiate your salary, look at the 990. They're disclosed on 990s. And so just know that that's information that's out there. It's kind of like filing taxes for nonprofit organizations. But just know that it's a great resource for you. And that's actually something that I've done. I've at night Googled like, 990, and especially like I said, when you're wanting to either negotiate, but also seeing kind of how the data is telling a story, go to a 990. So reporting requirements, this is gonna, like it's shared on the site, it's gonna vary from grant to grant. One thing that, I've had some grantors that, their reporting requirements are a couple paragraphs, and I have some that have been like, as larger than the grant application, like in some aspects. And this is, when you're going after, like I said, think of the end in mind. When you're starting to research grants, once you have your annual grant strategy, really look at, ask the funder, like what are some of the reporting requirements for this? What's the time that it's going to take? Not only that, what's the software? And this is going to vary. So for example, like we work with a lot of foundations that use Flux. We also work with a lot of organizations that have various softwares, and that in and of itself, that software system is like, you're going to have to learn to navigate. And so take all of that into account when you're trying to go after grant funding. like it says on here, some grant reports are going to require a really like detailed financial breakdown. So make sure that not only do you have your narrative report, which is really talking about the programmatic activities, but also making sure that you have the financial grant reporting as well. And so again, just keep the end in mind, the reporting requirement. Remember that life cycle. When you're going after grants, make sure that you're really being cognizant of the time it's going to take, because remember, some money is too expensive. Oh, the other thing I would say on reporting requirements is any sort of meetings that you have with funders, or like quotes, photographs. That's something else. Something one of my mentors always told me is that if you don't have a photo, it didn't happen. So when you're going after grants, and this is something that you want to humanize the work that you're doing. So I always try, as again, think with the end in mind. When we've received a grant award, always as you're doing this, make sure that you're getting photos, make sure that you're getting quotes, so you can add it to your grant, your grant report, just so you can humanize it. So funders' area of interest. So like it says here, every funder has a really particular area of interest, and you could always go to the mission statement. In addition to the mission statement, whether if it's values, vision statement, it's really our guiding principles, it's going to be located on there. So really look at that. That's also going to be a good template in terms of your narrative and your tone, and how you can make the case for the tie into your project or your organization to the funder. And so just again, really looking at that, using that that language, if you will, as kind of guiding light, or a way that you can make that tie in. Gregory, is there anything that you want to add to this?
Yeah, that when you're kind of preparing project development, and you're kind of considering how you're gonna prepare an application in that sort of pre-phase, getting a strong understanding of the language and the meaning behind all of the language in the areas of interest, or the investment priorities of the mission statement, kind of taking some time to break it down in terms of like a word by word, or sentence by sentence, or item by item approach. This way, when you are actually preparing your application, you have that language in your head, right? So for me, I kind of absorb all that as part of my pre-application process, right? I take some time to actually sit there and read it over and over and over again, so that I have a strong understanding of all of the items that the funder is putting out that they want to see people respond to. This way, it naturally flows into the application as I'm preparing it, right? It flows into the narrative and the goals that I create as part of our program development.
Yeah, and that's going to tie into this slide right here. And I'm happy to share out a template. I didn't include a snapshot of it, but what we've done when we've gone through, we've looked at funders' interest, looking at the eligibility requirements. I have a one-pager that I've used in the past where I kind of tie in, and if, again, kind of like going back with the grant log, I have, and this is actually a really good exercise. Like, for example, like if you have an assistant, or if you have a development assistant, someone that you want them to do a lot of the research to see like, okay, are we even eligible to go after this funding? You have that one pager where you can kind of go back and say, okay, this is a really great one, really great. Like if you want to look at a one pager and to see like type of organization, alignment with mission and vision, we have that I'm happy to share with everyone. And I'm going to kind of go through these last slides just to make sure that we get everyone out on time. So in terms of application process and deadlines, like we said, every funder is going to have a really unique area of interest. There's also going to be a process. And so make sure that, do not wait until the 11th hour to prepare your or to submit your application. And especially when working with federal, any sort of like federal opportunity, I cannot stress this enough. And I'm sure David and Eric and other people, give yourself a couple days. So even though, for example, like, make sure you give yourself 48 to 72 hours ahead of time, because it will always happen. You're going to have the system fail. You're going to have something going to happen with your computer. Your fax machine is not going to work. Your printer is not going to work. Like, just plan for that. That's going to happen. And so my recommendation is that once you've gone through, you've written, you've gotten everything uploaded to grants.gov, or to, you've consolidated it in your grant application, give yourself at least 48 to 72 hours for you to submit this grant, the grant application. David or Gregory, Eric, is there anything that you want to?
I would love to jump in and give one example. So try and find a backup plan as well. Have a peer or a coworker who can be able to access and submit your file for you should anything come up. One story I still get grief for, and I shared this with, me and David reminisced about this last week. My wife we were expecting my son, and a grant was due around when he was about a week or two before he was actually due. My wife went into labor. I left the day before the grant was supposed to be submitted. I actually came back to the office hours after my son was born, just so I could hit the submit button. And then I went back to the hospital. Try and come up with a backup plan so you don't have to go through something similar. That's all I'm saying.
That is a famous story around here. Yes, there are many grant writer tragedies and horror stories that I can share, but let's not. Instead, Emily has given good advice. One of the grant writers are familiar with the RFP, so you know when the actual deadline is, and that works against me often because I know when the real deadline is, and it would be better to have 48 hours to be done 48 hours before and avoid all those tragedies, because some of them are.
Yeah, it's
advice.
so heartbreaking. Yeah, if you put all that work into it and then you miss the deadline, it's just like, and that's happened to me. It's, again, and I want you to know, I want everyone on the line to know, that's a mistake that I've learned from. And that's where I want you to know, like, it's, in some of these instances where you learn from your mistakes and you make sure that you're getting it within. So learn from my mistake and know, like, make sure you give yourself that leeway, and that's going to allow you to double check, and even triple check your work. And RFP, I'm sure many of you know, so the request for proposals, it might be a NOFA. These are also acronyms that go back to that link that I shared, if you're not familiar with them. But again, like I said, make sure that you give yourself enough time. The other thing I would say, that not only make sure that you save it to your desktop, but what I always do, I have for every grant file that we have, and I'll just share with you, I print it off and I have it in these files. So God forbid anything happens to our system, I have a backup print, a copy, a hard copy that I could refer to. And if you're old school like me, I like having a printed so I can make my notes on it. And so I would highly recommend to, once you've submitted everything, not only make sure that you have, your entire application saved to your desktop or to your shared file, but also print it off so you can refer back to it. And as stated on the last bullet, you have your project narrative, your budget narrative, which again, we're going to be talking a little bit more about budgeting in another presentation. That's going to be really, really critical. And so other required documents, your SF 425s, letters of support, MOAs, which are memorandums of agreements, all of these things, you need to make sure that you have all of these things ready to submit. And like I said, make sure you give yourself that wiggle room. So when you're, kind of going off the theme of like, the important documents to have, one thing that we've done is kind of like, we brush our teeth every day. We make sure that we floss every day. I think it's just good practice for you to make sure every year you have an organizational chart, you have job descriptions, you have resumes. A lot of, especially federal funding opportunities, are going to ask, especially when you're working with agencies like the National Science Foundation, and they're asking for PIs. They're going to want to have resumes. And so make sure on an annual basis, you are, remember, like I said, you're laying that foundation, you're creating that process. Just make it a practice. October 1 comes around, or December, whatever your fiscal year is, you're asking, all right, put it on a calendar and say, all right, organization wide, I need everyone's resumes, or, I need the leadership resumes. I need an organizational chart. I need our strategic plan. I have these in my back pocket. So when going back to this slide, when you're getting ready to submit your application, you're not scrambling like, hey, I need your resume last minute. You have that in your back pocket. So again, just like how we brush our teeth every day, make sure that you are creating that, you have that practice in place to where, you know what, we're laying that foundation. We have that. And when you have that new hire come on board, say if someone transitions out, maybe make it part of your onboarding, your onboarding process, that you have that to where, again, you're not scrambling. You already have that. Another thing that, and this actually came from Katie Brinson, making sure that you have like a theory of change. If there's something, guiding your organization, you have some of that as part of your, not only your resumes, your organizational charts, you have some of that documentation. For example, here at the Heritage Center, we have our change narrative. And that's actually something that when we're uploading, I have that in my back pocket that I can, I could just pull from it. I don't have to like go scramble. And so again, it's laying that foundation to where you don't have to scramble last minute, which could then maybe cause you to miss a deadline. Job descriptions, like I said, another key component. Make sure that you have that. Resumes, job descriptions, any sort of letters of support. It's when you think of that recipe for success, it's right up there. And make sure that you have that. Like I said, good practice to do at the beginning of your fiscal year. Resumes for key staff. And then finally, just making sure that when you are building your kind of grants team, not only making sure that you have the end in mind, but making sure that, your team, this is going to be a consistent, you're building that process. You're going after these, you have a process in which you're going after grants. You have your annual strategy that you're going to be developing that you might work with Katie Brinson on, or you might develop it in-house, but make sure that you're not just going after funding just to go after funding, that your grants team, you really are laying that foundation to ensure that sustainability. And we've shared an example here, but something like I said, you're going to feel like you might be stumbling in the dark when you're going after, if you're kind of like a grants team of one, but always think of the end in mind. Think of the processes that you want to create, the foundation that you're laying. Make sure that you have a grant tracking log. If you don't have a grant tracking log, or if you don't have that eligibility form, it's a good way that you can, again, you're laying that foundation for others. If you want, if you're fixing or retire, or others who can come on and they could just, there's going to be that easy transition. And like I said, even though we're talking about pre-grant activities and making sure like the transactional stuff, you're making sure that you have your DUNS, you're making sure that you understand your budget, that kind of goes without saying. But the other thing, the big message that I want to make sure that I share with everyone is make sure that you're laying that foundation, that strong foundation, to where you can be sustainable. You can build upon that, and know that you do not have to reinvent the wheel. You have people like me, you have people like Greg, people like David and Eric who can help you. And we're in this work together. And like I said, tap into your network. If you've never gone after an A&A grant, or if you want to build a relationship, or you want to be more involved with an entity like Native Americans in philanthropy, this work, whether if it's private foundation funding or public, a lot of it is relationship based. So again, please feel free to reach out to us. And so I shared a lot of information. I hope that many of you, you were able to take a couple things away. Would love to hear your feedback if you have any sort of tips and advice for me to make sure that we're continuing to offer some helpful material. But like I said, the best way for you to grow your understanding in the grants world is to jump right in and to do it. And there are so many resources, like just a few that we've shared, that will help you. I know for me, the best way that I learn is to just jump in and to do it. But like I said, learn from our mistakes. We're here, we're a resource, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, we're going to open the floor. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Perfect. Well, I'm going to echo what Brian just put in the chat. This has been incredible. Emily, Gregory, you guys are amazing. Thank you for putting this together and sharing this information. I do in follow up want to let you all know that I will be sending out invitations to the next session. The date's TBD, but we will. For this session, it was a 20,000-foot view of grants. We're going to get a little bit more in the weeds in future classes and more of the technical aspects with writing and budgets and submissions. After this presentation, I will be sending out a summary, a link to the video, some visual complementary tools that can help you in your grant writing. And then if you have any questions, you have our contact information. And
Eric or David, was there something you wanted to say?
Just that this was great. Thank you. I'll use this video. This was good information.
I thought you wanted to add something. No, I see that there's a question in here. So Stephen, what organizations was it to assist in capacity building? So there are a couple, let me go back to that slide. So there are a couple different ones, depending if you want local. So I would refer to slides 12 and 13. But something that I would say specifically with capacity building. So there are two things I want to state. So funders today are really, they're couching some of their funding through the lens of capacity building. And what I just want to share with everyone, the capacity is there. You all are, I'm completely amazed. You're capable, you're phenomenal. What I really think that, and this is something we were talking about with the Ford Foundation yesterday, is it's not about the question of capacity building. It's a question about access to funds. And so know that you all are doing the work. And so to kind of grow the institutional or organizational capacity, there are a lot of resources out there, one being Murdoch Trust. I didn't include them on there, but they have a funding and they actually fund in Alaska. And so I would highly recommend look at Murdoch Trust for capacity building in terms of placing positions at your tribe or your nonprofit, but then also looking at organizations within Alaska. And like I said, refer to 12 and 13. Another thing that I would say that I actually just learned of this morning is Native Americans in Philanthropy is planning to do a roundtable across the country to inform funders around funding tribes. I think there's just so much misinformation on the funder side where they don't know that, as a federal tribe, we should have, we're able to have access, as, the same as a 501c3 nonprofit. And so kind of keep an eye out for that as well. And full disclosure, I serve on the board for NAP. So if you ever want to reach out to me, please do so. But again, refer to slides 12 and 13, and then look at the Murdoch Trust application. And so I want to make sure I'm answering. Okay. Yep. There's no other questions there, but thank you so much. And like I said, if you have any feedback, if you think I need to consolidate it or anything else, please feel free to reach out. This is something that I'm passionate about. And I really just want to say thank you, Eric, for allowing us the opportunity. And, we're just going to continue to refine this. And, I really, I'm a firm believer that, we do not need to send our people out to get an education. We have the experts like David and Eric and people here who have done this work. We don't need to go out and do that. We have that in our backyard. And I just want to say thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity.
Well, and I want to say thank you both. You did an amazing job, and I'm looking forward to the next class. So with that said, everyone take care, have a wonderful week and weekend, and we will be in touch.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.